Imagine walking down a public road on just a scorching afternoon.
Right.
You're carrying this incredibly heavy load. You're totally exhausted. But instead of just walking, you are legally required to howl at the top of your lungs every few steps.
It sounds completely absurd to us now.
Yeah, exactly. Why would you do that? Well, it was just in case your physical presence might accidentally pollute someone who is standing like 90 feet away.
It really sounds dystopian.
It does, like something out of a science fiction novel about, psychological torture. But for over 1,000 years, this was the daily, agonizing reality in a place that we now think of as this tropical paradise.
Yeah, it completely shatters the postcard image, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Because when we think of Kerala, India today, we picture houseboats on lush backwaters.
Right. Ayurveda retreats, progressive politics, high literacy rates.
Exactly. I mean, it literally markets itself globally as God's own country.
Yeah.
But if you peel back those layers and really dig into the soil, you uncover a history that is just profoundly unsettling. We are looking at a landscape that was fundamentally engineered for centuries to be a prison.
And when you and I normally talk about slavery, the mental image that universally comes to mind is the transatlantic slave trade.
Sure, yeah.
We picture ships crossing the ocean, auction blocks, physical iron chains. But for you listening today, we are taking a deep dive into a profoundly different mechanism of human ownership.
A completely different system.
Right. Our map for this journey is this brilliant, just devastating historical analysis called the architecture of servitude. And our mission today is to look past that modern progressive image and uncover this deeply entrenched hidden history.
Because it wasn't just economic exploitation, it was a totalizing system of social invisibility.
Okay, let's unpack this. How did a millennium-long system of servitude actually function without relying primarily on, physical chains?
Well, to understand the mechanics of it, we have to grasp what historians call agrestic or predial slavery.
Pre-deal, meaning soil-based.
Right? This wasn't a system where people were stolen from a distant homeland and transported across an ocean. In Kerala, the enslaved people were the indigenous populations.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And the crucial difference is that they were legally and spiritually tied to the very soil they lived on. They were quite literally treated as permanent fixtures of the earth.
It kind of reminds me of buying a laptop that comes with the operating system permanently pre-installed.
That's a good way to put it.
Like you can't separate the two.
Yeah.
In this system, when someone acquired the deed to a piece of land, the human beings who had lived on that land for generations came hardwired into the transaction.
Exactly.
You couldn't just buy the dirt. You bought the blood and sweat that was forced to work it.
That is a very visceral way to understand it, yeah. And the system required a incredibly powerful justification to survive for that long.
I mean, it had to.
Right, because if you are going to naturalize that level of extreme hierarchy, you can't just rely on military force. You have to weave it into the very fabric of the cosmos.
You have to make it divine.
Exactly. You have to start with the founding myths.
Right, because if it's just a human law, people will eventually rebel against it.
Yeah.
But if it's divine, that's a whole different story.
Exactly.
And the historical records here point to the legend of Parasurama, who is an avatar of the Hindu god Vishnu. The myth goes that he reclaimed the land of Kerala from the Arabian Sea by throwing his battle axe.
Right. And the critical part of that myth, at least as it's recorded in the regional mythic histories, is what he did with the land afterward.
He didn't just create it, right?
No, he gifted it exclusively to the Nambudhiri Brahmins. They became known as the Janmis, which translates essentially to lords of the soil.
Lords of the soil, wow.
Yeah. By divine decree, they owned the earth. And by extension, the indigenous people already living there were designated as their eternal cultivators.
Which perfectly removes the moral burden from the master.
It really does.
Like, if the gods decreed that my family owns the land and your family works it, then my enslavement of you isn't a crime. I'm just following divine orders.
Precisely. It makes the horrific seem completely natural. And we have concrete evidence showing how early this divine justification was transformed into brutal reality.
How early were we talking?
If we look back to the Sangam era of ancient South India, early Tamil literature describes enslaved agricultural workers having their chests branded.
Oh my God.
And the records note a detail that really just stops you in your tracks. They were branded using the exact same methods and tools used for war horses.
They were literally cataloging human beings as livestock.
Yes.
Wait, I need to wrap my head around this. If they're branding people, they must be keeping, like, official records. How early did this become a state-sponsored system?
Very early. There are these famous artifacts from 849 CE.
Late in 49?
Yeah, the Teresapalli copper plates, also called the Quilon copper plates. They record a grant of land to a local church. But nestled within the inscription is a specific term, dimakasu.
And what does that mean?
It translates to a slave levy.
Wait, they were taxing it.
Yes. By the 9th century, this wasn't some informal, under-the-table practice. It was a heavily bureaucratized institution.
Wow.
The state officially recognized the ownership of human beings as a taxable revenue stream.
So we have the mythic justification that makes it bulletproof to moral critique,
Right.
and we have the legal framework that taxes it like property.
Right.
But that still doesn't explain how you physically keep thousands of people subjugated without a massive, constant military presence. Like, how do you actually enforce this day to day?
You enforce it by weaponizing the concept of purity.
Okay.
The primary victims of this system were indigenous communities like the Cheramar and the Pulayer.
Well,
And the names themselves are a form of branding.
how so?
While Cheramar translates to children of the soil, reinforcing that inescapable connection to the dirt, but Pulaya is derived from the word pula, which literally means pollution.
Okay. And that brings us to this concept of unapproachability, Thiendal, right?
Exactly, Thiendal.
Now, I think a lot of people are vaguely familiar with the concept of untouchability within the caste system. You know, the idea that physical contact with certain groups is considered spiritually polluting.
Yes.
But unapproachability is a whole different level of psychological warfare. You didn't just pollute someone by touching them. You polluted them by simply existing within their radius.
It was an exact, terrifying mathematics of oppression.
There really was.
The social rules dictated incredibly specific spatial distances. If you were from the Pulayer community, you were legally required to stay exactly 90 feet away from a Brahmin.
90 feet.
Yes, and 64 feet away from a Nair, which was the warrior caste.
Think about the constant, exhausting mental load of that. You're out in the blazing sun, carrying a massive load of harvested paddy on your head, and you constantly have to calculate your physical distance from every other human being on the road.
Right.
How do you even measure 90 feet by eye when you're terrified for your life?
Yeah. Well, that anxiety was the point. And to ensure those distances were maintained, we get to the howling you mentioned at the start.
All right.
The enslaved people were forced to emit loud, rhythmic howling sounds whenever they walked on public thoroughfares. It was an auditory warning system.
To alert any upper caste individuals that a quote-unquote polluting body was approaching.
Exactly, giving them time to clear the area. And if there was an accidental encounter, like if you rounded a corner and stumbled within that 90-foot radius, the Nair warriors were legally empowered to draw their swords and kill the enslaved person on sight.
God. Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because forcing someone to howl to announce their own impurity is horrific. But the system went even deeper into the mind.
It did.
It invaded their own sense of self through language. You couldn't just physically trap them. You had to put them in a psychological straitjacket.
Yeah, what's fascinating here is how the architecture of servitude was built right into the grammar they were allowed to speak.
The grammar itself.
Yes. The goal wasn't just to extract cheap labor. It was total institutionalized servility.
Right. The historical sources point out that enslaved people were strictly forbidden from using the first-person pronoun I.
Think about that for a second. If a Pulaya person wanted to refer to themselves, they had to use the word Adian, which translates to your slave.
You literally couldn't claim your own existence in a sentence. Think about what that does to a person over generations.
That's devastating.
How do you talk to your own child? You can't say, I love you or I am scared. You have to say, your slave is scared.
Yes.
And it extended to everything around them. They couldn't call their dwellings houses. They had to refer to them as madam, meaning dumb huts.
Right.
They had to call their own meals karakati, which means dirty gruel. It is the systematic erasure of self-worth built into the very syllables they were allowed to form in their mouths.
It is brilliant in its cruelty. Every time an enslaved person spoke, ate, or walked down a road, they were actively participating in their own subjugation.
They didn't even need the physical chains.
Exactly. The physical chains weren't necessary because the chains were woven into their vocal cords and their footsteps.
Now, hearing all of this, you might naturally assume that this machinery of cruelty was strictly tied to the Hindu caste system,
All right, that's the common assumption.
that it was an isolated religious phenomenon built entirely on Hindu concepts of ritual purity.
Hmm.
But the history takes a massive, shocking pivot here, because this system was so economically profitable that it bled into entirely different religions.
Yes, this is a dimension of the region's past that has been heavily, heavily obscured.
Yeah,
The Syrian Christian community in Kerala, known as the Nasrani, were not just passive bystanders to this Hindu caste dynamic.
they were involved.
Deeply involved. They were major landholders, and they were highly active, enthusiastic participants in the slave economy.
Wait, really? A completely different theology just adopted the exact same system of soil slavery.
Absolutely. They acted as key intermediaries, especially later on during the European colonial periods. And the evidence for this isn't just anecdotal.
Right, the source text had specific records.
Researchers have found these 18th and 19th century palm leaf manuscripts hidden away in church archives, the Mathalakam Rekakal. These are secular, highly detailed transfer deeds.
I was looking at one of those translations, and it is chillingly corporate.
Yeah.
There's a record from 1845 detailing the sale of two human beings, a male named Amrithi and a female named Mani. And they were sold to a man named Taman Varki for 601 chakrams.
Which historically was about 21 rupees.
Just a receipt for human lives casually filed away in a church archive.
And their involvement permeated the spiritual life of the church as well through a practice known as Adima offerings.
Okay, this part blew my mind. I need you to explain how this actually worked, because it sounds like a horrific spiritual contradiction.
It really is.
Yeah.
In this practice, devotees would offer themselves, or sometimes their own children, to the church or a specific deity as an act of lifelong spiritual devotion.
But not just symbolic devotion.
No, this wasn't just a symbolic gesture of faith. It came with binding, lifelong financial obligations. They literally paid adimapanam, which translates to slave money, directly to the church.
So they are taking the secular structure of slavery and turning it into a vehicle for expressing religious piety.
Exactly.
That is so deeply unsettling.
Yeah.
And the physical spaces of the churches were compromised too, weren't they?
Yes. During the Dutch era, we have records showing that church buildings in Cochin were utilized as go-downs,
Go-downs.
which is a colonial term for warehouses. They used the church grounds to store lower caste slaves before they were auctioned off right there on the premises.
A place of worship acting as a human warehouse.
Yeah.
It entirely shatters the idea of the sanctuary. You have people inside praying for salvation, and outside in the courtyard, human beings are being warehoused like sacks of grain.
It demonstrates a seamless blending of commerce and spiritual authority. The logic of human bondage was so powerful, so normalized in the region, that it completely transcended religious boundaries.
The church just functioned as another corporate master. Exactly.
Okay, so we have the indigenous myths creating the foundation, the extreme caste rules enforcing the daily psychology, and the religious institutions localizing and normalizing the commerce.
Right.
But what happens when global empires show up? Because the Europeans arrive, and they don't look at this and say, this is terrible, we should stop it.
Oh, none at all.
They look at it and say, wow, this is incredibly efficient. Let's plug it into our global shipping pipeline.
Exactly. We start to get a glimpse of this global transition through the accounts of foreign travelers. Like in the 14th century, the Moroccan scholar Ibn Battuta visited the region.
And what does she see?
He noted something peculiar. There were very few beasts of burden, like horses or donkeys. Instead, human beings were used to carry all the heavy goods. He observed this incredibly efficient, interconnected road system, but noted it was built entirely on the broken backs of a heavily subjugated porter class.
So the infrastructure is already there. Then the European powers arrive. The Portuguese are the first major player, right? Yeah, and they start importing African slaves, primarily from places like Mozambique, to supplement the labor force.
And locally, these individuals were known as Capiris.
Yes. And the legacy of that Portuguese involvement is captured in this incredibly dark piece of local folklore in Kochi, the myth of Kapiri Mufapan.
Right. The legend goes that in 1663, the Dutch were attacking Kochi, and the Portuguese were forced to flee.
Exactly.
They had amassed massive amounts of wealth and couldn't carry it all, so they buried it inside the city walls or underground. But to ensure nobody stole it, they sacrificed their African slaves.
Yeah, believing that the murdered spirits of the enslaved would be bound to eternally guard the treasure until the Portuguese returned.
And the staggering dark irony of this is that today, in Fort Kochi, there are actual shrines dedicated to Kapiri Mufapen.
Yes, people go there today.
They go there to leave offerings of cigars and alcohol. Modern people are essentially venerating the victims of colonial violence who were murdered to protect stolen wealth. They've turned a historical atrocity into a local superstition.
It's wild.
Yeah,
And
sure.
if we connect this to the bigger picture, the subsequent Dutch arrival took this tragedy and industrialized it to a terrifying degree.
A Dutch East India Company.
Right, the VOC. They didn't just use enslaved labor locally in Malabar. They recognized a cheap supply chain when they saw one. So they created a massive, highly bureaucratic pipeline exporting enslaved people from India to their other colonies.
Specifically to South Africa, right?
Yes, to Cape Town.
How does that even work practically? You take a caste-based system where people are tied to the soil, and you somehow turn them into international maritime cargo.
You do it by stripping away the complex local caste dynamics and reducing them to raw corporate data. The Dutch archives from this period are meticulously chilling.
Like ledgers and stuff?
Yeah, they kept these transport acts and registers that logged the names, ages, and castes of the people they were exporting.
The scale of it is hard to fathom. The historical data shows that between 1697 and 1750, almost half, like 48% of the total slave population in the Cape Colony in South Africa came from Malabar and Bengal.
Yes, 48%. They were taking individuals, people like Damon and Cupido, who we only know about because the archives record their violent deaths trying to escape in Cape Town. And many of these were children. They were kidnapped by local agents in Kerala, or they were sold by their starving parents during severe famines.
And then they were packed in these miserable custom-built Dutch cargo ships called fluits.
Yes, they turned human tragedies into neat little entries in global ledgers.
It's just a vast, terrifying
Yeah.
global web. So with such immense profit tied to this system, locally from the Brahmin landlords and the Syrian Christian churches and globally from the Dutch East India Company, how on earth does a machine this big ever stop?
It wasn't easy.
The road to abolition must have been a nightmare.
It was incredibly messy, highly fragmented, and ferociously resisted by the elites. You have to look at how the region was divided administratively in the 19th century.
Okay.
There were three main areas: Malabar, which was directly ruled by the British, and the princely states of Travancore and Kochi, which had more autonomy.
And the British are often given credit for ending slavery with the Indian Slavery Act of 1843.
Right, but on the ground in Malabar, that act was basically a piece of paper.
It didn't do anything.
It had almost zero impact because the British administration actually relied on the high revenue generated by enslaved labor. The enslaved people were utterly dependent on their masters for their daily gruel. They couldn't just walk away into the jungle.
Right. The legal title changed, but the lived nightmare continued entirely uninterrupted.
It was maintained under the guise of debt bondage or hired labor.
So what does this all mean? It means the British didn't actually execute a moral abolition in Malabar. They executed a PR rebrand.
Exactly.
They stopped using the word slaves and started calling them a plantation proletariat. It's administrative sleight of hand.
It absolutely was. Meanwhile, in Travancore, the state itself owned thousands of slaves. They utilized a system of forced, unpaid state labor called uziam for public works. Yeah, it took decades of incremental, loophole-ridden decrees, usually pushed by British residents who were just embarrassed by the optics, before the Maharaja finally issued a total abolition proclamation in 1855.
And Kochi followed a similarly reluctant timeline.
Yes, bondage lingered there until around 1872.
And we have to recognize who was actually waiting for this freedom. It wasn't just the hereditary slave castes.
Right.
You had people who were enslaved as punishment for breaking those extreme 90-foot distance rules we talked about earlier.
But Dandara sama.
Yeah. And perhaps most tragically, you had people who had willingly sold themselves into slavery just to survive intense, devastating famines. Yudoradasa.
And the push to finally end this came from multiple fronts. You had Protestant missionaries like the CMS and LMS, who were among the first to publicly challenge the morality of the system.
Right. They established slave schools.
Yes, and offered religious conversion as a path to basic human dignity, defying the upper castes.
But I love that the historical record makes it very clear that this wasn't just some top-down rescue mission by missionaries and colonial bureaucrats.
Oh, definitely not.
There was massive, immense bottom-up resistance. The enslaved people exercised agency every chance they got. Long before the missionaries arrived, there were runaway Marine communities hiding deep in the forests, surviving off the grid.
And the cultural resistance was just as vital as the physical escape. Look at figures like Poikel Apachan.
Yes, the Dalit leader.
Exactly. He was born to enslaved parents and founded a powerful socio-religious movement, the PRDS. He realized that the ultimate weapon of slavery in Kerala wasn't just the physical labor, it was that erasure of history we discussed.
The linguistic invisibility.
Yes.
The fact that they couldn't say I.
Exactly. So what did he do? He wrote songs. He used music and oral history to lament the loss of his people's past and to forge a new, unified identity.
That's powerful.
He essentially turned the generational memory of slavery into the engine for a profound social renaissance.
The sheer courage it takes to build a cultural renaissance out of a history that explicitly told you that you were a polluting force on the earth. I mean, it's incredible.
It really is.
But as we bring this deep dive into the present day, we have to look at the long shadow this leaves. Because the stroke of a pen in 1855 didn't magically fix the psychology of a society.
No, the post-abolition reality was incredibly bleak. These newly free laborers were turned out without any land, without any money, and without any social standing.
So what do they do?
Well, it birthed what historians call a backdoor culture that lasted well into the 20th century.
A backdoor culture.
Yeah, descendants of enslaved families were restricted to menial tasks. And if they were fed by upper caste employers, they were forced to eat from separate plates or even leaves at the back doors of the homes.
Wow. And that deep generational trauma is still being actively processed today. There is a profoundly moving contemporary ritual that highlights this perfectly.
Yes, the Passion Week ritual.
Right. In Trivandrum, there are Dalit congregations within the Marthoma Syrian Church. During Passion Week, they hold a ritual where the congregants eat food out of small holes dug directly into the ground.
It is a direct, deliberate reference to their ancestors.
Yeah.
Historically, Pulaya slaves were often fed in pits dug into the earth, specifically so their masters wouldn't risk spiritual pollution by handing them a physical plate.
By incorporating that deep historical humiliation right into their modern religious practice, they are taking ownership of the trauma.
Exactly. They are refusing to let it be erased or glossed over.
And for you, listening to this, that is why this deep dive matters. The history of agrestic slavery in this region has been described as a bitter truth knowingly forgotten.
It has.
But looking past the tourist brochures to the blood and sweat buried in the soil is the only way any society can actually understand its present identity.
This raises an important question, though, a question that builds on everything we've uncovered today.
What's that?
Well, we've looked closely at a historical society that used extreme physical distance measurements, calculated linguistic rules, and even the very architecture of their religious buildings to enforce the complete invisibility of their essential labor class.
Yeah, they engineered the people who built their world entirely out of sight.
They made the labor invisible so they wouldn't have to look at the humanity of the laborer.
Exactly.
So we must ask ourselves, in what subtle, unrecognized ways might our modern economic systems still be doing the exact same thing?
That's a great point.
How are we using modern spatial zoning, gig economy classifications, and sterile corporate language to keep today's most essential, vulnerable workers comfortably unseen?
It makes you look at the world around you completely differently, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The maps we use, the distances we keep from the people who deliver our food or clean our streets, it really makes you wonder what else is buried in the soil we walk on every day.